Are you ready? Good morning. Is this on? Good morning. I'm Stanley Greene. I'm a member of the Speakers Bureau of Stop Abuse for Everyone. Unfortunately, my longtime friend and colleague, Carol Crabson, was not able to be here to co-present with me. She, 60 hours ago, got an unexpected positive COVID test result on a PCR test. So she sent comments that I am going to read in her voice as I proceed through what was to be our co-presentation. Blood streamed down my face. I had lacerations and contusions from my head to my groin, front and back. Internal injuries pulled my right rib cage more than 5 centimeters out of alignment. I demanded that the hospital security person who came moments after I was attacked call the police. The police officers came and I insisted that they take a report. We're not taking a report from you, buddy. You're lucky we're not hauling you off to jail. Why did that happen? Because at the time this happened in Long Beach, California law defined domestic violence solely as something that a man does to a woman. And that was the culture and the training beyond California. That law changed 17 years later when my longtime friend, dear colleague, and martyr, he was assassinated 2 years ago, Mark Angelucci, won a California Court of Appeals case, which required that all domestic violence programs serve everyone regardless of gender. But at the time of this attack, this gender bias was codified into the statutes of the state of California. Carol wrote, "Good morning. At the time that Stanley was experiencing this horrific abuse by his partner and neglect from law enforcement, my predecessor and mentor, Patricia Overberg, made the decision to go against the current beliefs and values of the feminist movement. Her philosophy was that anyone suffering from domestic violence deserves safety, services, and support. In the early 1990s, she opened the doors of the Valley Oasis shelter to male victims. These services were also available to boys over the age of 13. And she served transgender persons and had them on her staff. During this era, the common belief was that a male child living in a setting where domestic violence was occurring would automatically become an abuser, and in a shelter could be an abuser or a rapist. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Pat Overberg. Pat, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Pat Overberg made the Valley Oasis the first full-service domestic violence shelter in North America and probably beyond to serve men, and the first in the county of Los Angeles to serve the entire LGBT community. And for at least 15 years, the Valley Oasis was the only full-service domestic violence shelter in North America serving men. She was a pioneer. Pat described herself as a tough old broad. I was raised not to refer to senior women that way, but I didn't argue with Pat. She had to be tough to do what she did at the time. And she's one of the goddesses of this movement, frankly, and doesn't get enough credit. The Valley Oasis is located in Lancaster, California, approximately 100 kilometers northeast of the city of Los Angeles. And just for a sense of perspective, it's geographically a large county, but population-wise, there are 40 states in the United States with a smaller population than Los Angeles County. After the attack that I just described, I made sure that my children were safe with my parents. And then I spent almost an hour phoning every domestic violence shelter I could find in the phone books of the city of Long Beach and the city of Los Angeles. Each of them replied, "We serve women." Well, what would you tell? And I wasn't asking for shelter. I was asking, how can I get a police report taken? Because I had read my former wife's Ms. magazines for a number of years. And even though, of course, that was always in gendered terms, I knew that if you were the victim of an intimate partner violence attack, you should get a police report taken and you should get medical documentation before you change clothes, bathe, or anything else. So Right after I had made sure my children were safe, I went to a medical clinic and got documentation and treatment. Then I went to my parents' apartment where my children were safe and phoned asking, how can I get a police report taken? I was not asking to be sheltered. I was only asking for advice on how to get a police report taken. We're here to serve women. Well, what would you tell a woman to whom the police had refused to take a report? Well, we wouldn't know what to say to a man. That's the response I got from every single one of the battered women's shelters I phoned. So then I phoned the sexual assault crisis line, and the person there said, we recognize that men can be victims of sexual assault. We recognize that men can be victims of domestic violence. And she gave me clear instructions on what division of the Long Beach Police Department, city of 400,000, to phone, what to ask for, what to expect. And she said, if that does not work, call me back and I will intervene directly. So hours after the attack, 2 police officers came to my parents' apartment. We went into the bedroom with my father. I stripped down. My father photographed the injuries, again, from my groin to my head. And the police officer said, a person who's capable of doing this to you is capable of killing you. Carol notes, in the 1990s, all shelters served only battered women. Coming out of the grassroots battered women's movement, people working in shelters at this time were predominantly women who had been battered themselves. Any call from a man was deemed suspicious and was thought to be the batterer attempting to find his spouse. 24-hour hotlines focused on collecting information to assess the safety and lethality levels of the female victim of abuse. During this time, I, Carol, began to train staff on how to respond to potential male victims, developing a hotline questionnaire that was gender neutral and hired staff who were diverse. The staff included people representing African Americans, members of the Hispanic community, and members of the LGBTQIA+ community, different religious orientations, as well as people with degrees in human services and social work. Well, Carol was doing that, and unfortunately, I wasn't connected with Carol or Pat while this was happening to me. 3 days after the attack, it happened on a Friday night, I tried to fill out the forms to get a restraining order. There was no help for me to do that. I'm dealing with government forms I've never seen before. I spent hours. One of my mother's friends had a home office with a typewriter and copy machine and such, and I did the best I could. Once I had them filled out, I rushed down to the courthouse, got the bureaucratic runaround. You need the 3rd floor, no, you need the 5th floor, etc. I dash into the courtroom 15 minutes before the deadline. They look at the papers and say, well, you're represented by an attorney. A divorce was already underway at this time. I said, I fired that attorney. Nope, we can't see you. On my way out, a very well-dressed white woman comes up to me in tears because she had had a somewhat similar experience and she needed to phone home. Almost nobody had cell phones in 1990, and she didn't have any coins, and she had probably never asked for money from a stranger before in her life. And she asked if I had a few coins she could make to call home. And I dug into my pocket, gave her some coins, and we both stood there and cried. The following day, I had a new attorney. I went into the court. I had medical reports from 2 clinics documenting the injuries I mentioned, photos, and I had finally gotten a police report. The judge looked at all of this documentation. My assailant was not claiming that I had attacked her. She insisted that my injuries were self-inflicted, which was a physical impossibility. The judge looked at all of the documentation and laughed. He said, well, you have to expect one knockdown, drag out fight per divorce. And he issued mutual restraining orders, even though she wasn't asking for a restraining order and she did not claim I had assaulted her. In the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that every citizen has a right to own a firearm. If you're the subject of a restraining order, you are not allowed to possess a firearm. I don't choose to own a firearm, but it is in the United States a constitutional right. I lost a constitutional right because I was the victim of a violent crime and because of the gender bias. Carol writes, I also began collaborating with the great pioneers of the time who are advocating for male victims, including, she refers to me, to Mark Angelucci and Phil Cook, who authored the first book about male victims of domestic violence called Male Victims, the Hidden Survivors, Male Survivors, the Hidden Victims of Domestic Violence. There's 2 editions of that book now. And she worked with Harry Crouch. And again, back to Carol. During the 1990s through the early 2000s, Carol and the Valley Oasis experienced similar repercussions to what I experienced. I'm referring to myself. The agency and Carol were not well liked. Their philosophy was considered victim blaming, and efforts made to educate people about the dynamics of domestic abuse experienced in males were met with hostility. This included courtrooms where attempts to counter how judges were responding to male victims. The staff of Valley Oasis, including Carol, began to attend court hearings as advocates so we could speak on the victim's behalf and begin in earnest court education on male and LGBTQ+ education. This was met with disregard and personal attacks on our education experience and the lack of academic research on the subject. Shortly, back to my own voice. Several months after the attack, I was in court. And by the way, my household was an upper middle class household. My spouse was a physician. I'm an engineer with a master's degree. We were an upper middle class white family living in a neighborhood where today the homes are probably valued at $3 or $4 million each. And when I had been the primary caregiver of our children for 5 years. And the judge asked me what my career plans were. This was in the trial, 5 days just on material and economic matters. There was no evidence yet submitted on custody, child parenting, or anything like that. The judge asked me what my plans were. And I said, well, I'm working on developing a consulting career that I can work out of a home office. And I described the technology of that era, which I would use, and the concept that as my children got older and got into school, I would do more work outside the home. The judge, who is a man who was probably born in the late 1910s, there are generational attitudes here, which is why I point that out. An older white male judge bellows, "Young man, you need to go out and find a regular job and fulfill a traditional father role. Your children will respect you more, and what's more, you will respect yourself more. And furthermore, you will be living nearby with continuing and frequent contact." Again, this was before any hearings on parenting, custody, or anything, but continuing and frequent contact was part of buzzword, what I call part of the language oppression of family court. Continuing and frequent contact in the context of California family court meant kids are with dad every other weekend and maybe one evening a week and during certain vacations. He had already made up his mind on where the children would go because of my gender, even though no evidence had been presented regarding parenting skills by either parent. I submitted a transcript of that to the Los Angeles County Commission on the Status of Women. There was and is no commission on the status of men. One of the commissioners, the late June Dunbar, wrote a letter on Commission for Women letterhead to the supervising judge protesting the gender biased remarks of the judge in my case. It had no legal effect, but it was great moral support. Ms. Dunbar later, I met her at a meeting and I said, "Ms. Dunbar, it's an honor to meet you. I consider you to be a feminist with a lowercase f." And she knew what I meant. That she was a feminist who was actually committed to the ideals of equality. Her lens was primarily looking at women and girls, but she focused on inequalities rather than on the typical dogma of second wave feminism of that era. And she invited me to participate in a committee which she chaired with the Los Angeles County Domestic Violence Council. And that is what launched me as an activist, and she was my mentor. And so I attended the Los Angeles County Domestic Violence Council meetings and the committee which she chaired. Again, this Domestic Violence Council represents a county with more than 10 million people. And in those meetings, I met Pat Overberg, who was doing her pioneering work then in the early 1990s. And I saw firsthand how terribly Pat was treated by most of the women in the County Domestic Violence Council because she served men and she had a transgender person on her staff. And a transgender person under that 1990s second wave feminist dogma, a transgender man was a woman who had given up the sacred precincts of womanhood, and a transgender woman was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Later, there was a custody evaluation process. And I tried to talk to the custody evaluator about the domestic violence. And he says, "You're being controlling. I'm running what we talk about here." Nonetheless, he recommended joint physical, joint legal custody for a year to see how things worked out. In the trial, the attorney asked him, if one parent received sole custody, which parent would be the most likely to facilitate access for the other parent? And he said it would obviously be the father. The judge who made the remarks I pointed out earlier ordered that my abuser was to receive sole physical and sole legal custody. I nearly vomited. My parents had to hold my arms to walk out of the courtroom. For the rest of their childhood and into adulthood, I had no authority and no say in any decisions about the health, welfare, or education of my children. Back to Carol. The Valley Oasis, being one of the first shelters offering direct therapeutic services to victims while residing in the shelter, offered both individual therapy to adults and children, as well as peer counseling and group therapy. The group therapy was the most controversial, as the groups included men. This tactic was seen by victim advocates as traumatizing to victims, as well as placing them in some contrived physical harm. What I learned in facilitating these groups is that when focusing on the trauma and betrayal and dissecting the work of Lenore Walker's battered women syndrome, that having both males and females in this groups, the people learned that not all people were batterers. All people were able to talk about their experiences and learn from each other. We saw a significant increase in trust between the men and women. We saw self-doubt and blame decrease while self-esteem increased. Extraordinarily strong positive bonds were formed between the residents, which helped in the healing process. This information came from group evaluations the residents filled out at the end of each group, as well as from monthly evaluations completed by residents with their advocate and by observation of each individual. Around this time, I appeared on a major talk radio show in the Los Angeles radio market with Pat Overberg while Pat was still running the Valley Oasis. Carol was working for her then. Carol was Pat's handpicked successor. And I have an audio recording of that radio show. One of the callers asked, "Do you have men and women in the same support group?" And Pat said, "Yes." The caller says, "Well, doesn't that make the women uncomfortable?" And Carol says, "No, they find out that the men have had the same experiences they've had." And I wish I could replicate Pat's wonderful Rhode Island accent. Carol can do that much better. Carol and I, when we get together, we channel St. Pat. Well, when we're having a problem, what would St. Pat say? And then we come up something which is usually rather profane and possibly something less profane than what Pat herself would have said. But again, she had to be a tough old broad to do what she did when she did it. After I'd had several months of intensive therapy, including several months where I was seeing psychiatrists and psychologists a few times a week, I decided to make one, and I felt I'd achieved some level of healing. I decided I would make one last effort to try to get my assailant prosecuted. And I phoned Rainbow Services, a domestic violence program in the Harbor District of Los Angeles in San Pedro. And the person who answered was clearly treating me as a perpetrator, posing as a victim. And because of all the intensive therapy I'd had for many months, I was assertive with her. And they put the executive director on the line. If that had happened to me in the immediate aftermath of the attack, it probably would have pushed me into being suicidal. And the executive director told me that they trained their frontline people to treat any male caller as a perpetrator posing as a victim. But the executive director, I went to meet her, I brought her the documentation, and she agreed to go to the district attorney's office, the prosecution service, with me to try to persuade them to prosecute my assailant. Now, I want to pause and say that and the many media appearances I've had would never have happened. I've been on the Oprah Winfrey Show, AB News 2020, many print and broadcast media throughout the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. None of that would have happened if I hadn't obtained all of this documentation. Harpo Productions, Oprah's company, sent a temporary secretary to my home for 2.5 days to go through my paperwork because my ex-wife hauled me into court in all but 2 calendar years from 1990 through 2007. From 1990 through 2007, I was in court between 1 and 20 times per year in all but 2 calendar years. And guess what? Paperwork became a major PTSD trigger for me, a mountain of paperwork. And so Harpo Productions, pardon me, it was ABC News before I was on 2020, their first segment on battered men. ABC News in New York hired a temp secretary in Walla Walla to spend 2.5 days in my home to organize the papers and send their attorneys the documents necessary to vet me to appear on the show. And I later used that same documentation for Harpo Productions in order to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show. When I was on the Oprah Winfrey Show, one of the questions they were addressing was, should men receive alimony? And Oprah introduced each of the 5 guests individually as we walked out onto the stage with something about that person. And when I walked out, what she said about me was something, she quoted me, something I had told the producer in the lengthy telephone interviews before being filmed in her studio. And here's Stanley Greene, who says, the question should be, should anyone receive alimony? And if the answer is yes, there should be a set of objective criteria, none of which is level of estrogen. I told Harpo that if they ever wanted to do a segment on battered men, I'd help line up people for that, but they didn't follow up with me on that, although they did eventually cover that issue. So I became increasingly involved with the Los Angeles County Domestic Violence Council. And again, June Dunbar, the commissioner for women, which because she was a founding member of the Los Angeles County, I'm sorry, I accidentally pushed the mute button. Thank you. So Commissioner June Dunbar was very high status in this institution because she was a founding member of the Commission for Women. She would usually sit with me. Like if she came in after I was there, she would come and sit next to me. And other women in the council would really scowl when they would see that, particularly Sheila James Kuehl. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, a television show from the late 1950s and early 60s about teenagers. Sheila James Kuehl was Zelda, the teenage girl who had a crush on the title character. And Sheila James Kuehl went on to become a state legislator for many years, very misandrist, and then is now on the LA County Board of Supervisors. So this is a government serving 10 million people. There is no executive like a president or a premier. It is 5 legislators who run the entire county of 10 million. So it's one of the most powerful elected positions in the United States. And in my first meeting with Ms. Kuehl back around 1992, she was talking about legislation in Sacramento and a bill particularly that would say that if the suspect had a gun, it would be taken away. And she kept saying, when the police come and find the man has a gun, blah, blah, blah. So I raised my hand and I said, Ms. Kuehl, I appreciate the work you're doing for survivors of domestic violence, but as a survivor myself, I would be more comfortable if you would use gender neutral language. And let me point out that if all of those of you who have studied second wave feminist theory will know that gender neutral or gender inclusive language was a cornerstone of the second wave feminist movement, except when they were dealing with domestic violence and sexual assault. Ms. Kuehl responds to me, well, I know something happened to you. I don't know what it is, but I'm fighting it out in the halls of Sacramento with all those misogynistic legislators, and all domestic violence is rooted in the hatred of women. And again, she went on to become one of the most powerful politicians in California. Several years later, Mark Angelucci phoned me while I was in New York and asked me to alter my itinerary and go to Sacramento to testify against a bill written by then Senator Kuehl in the California Senate Judiciary Committee. When she saw me walk into that hearing room, she had a big scowl on her face. And it was a bill that would define primary aggressor. And it had a list of criteria, such as size. And I said, this bill uses surrogate measures in the same way that Southern states use non-racial surrogate measures to exclude most Black people from voting. And the committee forced her to rewrite the bill. The Los Angeles County Domestic Violence Council reluctantly agreed to allow Carol and I to form a task force on male victims. So after the late Mark Angelucci, assassinated in 2019, after he won that victory in 2008, overturning the gender bias in California law, he asked me and several others to work on implementing that law in LA County. He asked me specifically because of my history of working with the LA County Domestic Violence Council. So for several years, I was going from southeastern Washington State, where I live, to LA for meetings 6 or 8 times a month. And eventually they agreed to form a task force on male victims and survivors of domestic violence with Carol and me as co-chairs. As far as I know, that was the first governmental entity specifically addressing male victims and survivors anywhere in the US or Canada or anywhere. I'm not aware of any, but we were met with massive resistance with the second wave feminists who are still running things. But Carol received later, just this last October, the Domestic Violence Council's first ever award for outreach to underserved populations. That's because the council had gotten a new executive director who supported inclusive services. Carol retired last week. So back to Carol. For those who would like to learn more about her services are provided currently and the trauma-informed methods used, Carol and I would make ourselves available for future training. And back to me, Carol's role in this is very historically significant, on the shoulders of Pat Overberg, her mentor, our dear friend who handpicked her. Thank you very much.